This is the story of the single greatest act of defiance in the history of Arda. It is the moment when despair was forged into a weapon, when a mortal king challenged a fallen god to single combat, and when a wound was dealt that would never truly heal. Before the courage of a hobbit at the cracks of doom, before the fall of Gondolin or the might of Númenor, one elf stood alone against the primordial source of all evil. His quest was not to destroy a ring or reclaim a kingdom. His aim was to strike the face of the master of all shadow, a goal that makes the entire War of the Ring seem a distant echo of a far greater conflict. This was not a war of armies. This was a king's final, hopeless judgment, delivered at the very gates of hell. To understand the fury that drove Fingolfin, High King of the Noldor, to his final battle, one must first understand the silence that preceded the storm. For nearly 400 years of the sun, a tense peace had held across the northern lands of Beleriand. This was the age of the siege of Angband. After their calamitous flight from the blessed realm of Valinor, the Noldoran elves, in their pride and their wrath, had waged a bitter war against the Dark Lord Morgoth. They had driven his armies of orcs back into their infernal fortress and established a great watch, a chain of fortresses and hidden realms that penned the enemy in. For generations, the elves lived in this armed but stable reality. They built great cities in secret. They forged alliances with the nascent race of men. They grew powerful, and in their power, they grew complacent. The memory of the darkness that had driven them to Middle-earth began to fade, replaced by the gilded comfort of their own kingdoms. They believed they had contained evil, that Morgoth was a prisoner in his own dungeon. They were wrong. Morgoth was never idle. In the fathomless pits of Angband, he bred new horrors and new legions. He twisted creatures into monstrous shapes and filled his armories with weapons of steel and fire. He did not merely wait. He plotted an annihilation so total, so absolute, that it would scour the elves from the world. And in the depths of winter, his moment came. The attack came without warning. It was not a sortie of orcs or a probing assault. It was the land itself that turned against the elves. The Iron Mountains, the Esred Engren, erupted. From the peaks of Thangorodrim, the triple-peaked volcanic mountains Morgoth had raised above his fortress, rivers of fire poured forth. They flowed down across the plains of Ardgalen, a liquid inferno that consumed everything in its path. The green fields and cool grasses that lay before Angband's gates were burned to black, choking ash in minutes. The great siege was broken. This was the Dagor Bragollach, the Battle of Sudden Flame. The once beautiful plain was forever renamed Anfoglith, the gasping dust. The fire was followed by the greatest army of orcs ever assembled, and with them came the Balrogs, demons of shadow and flame, led by Gothmog their lord. And for the first time in that age, the world saw the greatest and most terrible of Morgoth's creations, Glaurung, the Golden, the father of all dragons. He was a serpent of fire, and the elves fled before him in terror, for their swords could not pierce his hide, and his gaze held a venomous madness. The elven lines shattered. The sons of Finarfin, Angrod and Aegnor, were slain on the slopes of the northern highlands, their forces utterly annihilated. The armies of Maedhros, stationed in the east, were routed and scattered. The fortress on the pass of Sirion, held by Fingolfin's own son, was taken. News of the defeat spread like a poison through the veins of Beleriand. Hope, which had burned bright for 4 centuries, was extinguished in a single night of fire and death. But what drives a king, a being of immense wisdom and power, to abandon all strategy and ride alone to certain death? It was not simply rage. It was a final, desperate statement against the void. In his stronghold of Hithlum, Fingolfin, High King of all the Noldor in Middle-earth, received the tidings. He heard of the rivers of fire, of the coming of the dragon, of the deaths of his kin, and of the utter ruin of the armies of the north. From his vantage point, he could see the distant smoke and the shadow that now lay upon the world, and it seemed to him that all was lost. The final, irreversible doom of the Noldor had come, a defeat from which there could be no recovery. The oath they had sworn, the hope they had carried across the grinding ice, it had all turned to ash. A despair so profound that it became a form of madness seized him. It was a wrath born of utter hopelessness. In that moment he saw the long game of Morgoth not as a war, but as a cruel jest. And he, the High King, was the fool. He saw the suffering of his people, the breaking of their spirits, and he would not endure it. He would not wait for the slow, grinding extinction that Morgoth had planned. He resolved to make one final, terrible act. An act of defiance so pure it would be sung of by elves and men until the world was remade. He went to his armory and clad himself for a battle he knew he could not win. He donned his silver mail, and over it, a blue surcoat embroidered with crystals. He took up his great shield, also blue, which was set with a star of crystal. He strapped to his side his sword, Ringil, whose blade glittered like ice with a pale, cold light. He placed upon his head a tall helmet adorned with a crest of white. When he was arrayed, he looked less like a king going to war and more like a star falling from the heavens to deliver a final, brilliant flash of light before being consumed by the night. He went to his stables and called for Roshalaur, his great war-horse. He mounted the steed, taking up his long spear, and without a word to his captains or his people, he rode forth from the gates of his fortress. Alone, those who saw him pass were filled with awe and terror, for such was the wrath that burned in him, and so terrible was the light of his eyes, that they cried aloud that Orm himself, the great Vala, the huntsman of the gods, had come to ride among them. They did not dare to hinder him. They could only watch as their king became a shining speck, riding into the gathering dark. He rode with a speed and fury that no orc could withstand. He passed through the lands of Mithrim and Dornufauglith, his path a direct line to the heart of the enemy's power. The legions of Morgoth that swarmed the blasted plains saw him coming and fled. They mistook him for a spirit of vengeance, a wrathful god come down from the mountains to reap a terrible harvest. They scattered before him, a tide of filth receding before a wave of pure, concentrated light. He did not slow. He did not falter. He rode across the dead, cracked earth of the Anfauglith, the dust rising like a shroud around the hooves of Roshalaur. Before him loomed the 3 peaks of Thangorodrim, smoking like vents into hell itself, and at their roots, the colossal gates of the fortress of Angband. He would not face a mere legion. He would not face a captain. He would sound his horn at the very gates of hell, and demand the tyrant himself answer for his crimes. But could a challenge born of despair ever hope to succeed? He had reached his destination. He stood alone before the source of the world's woe. He took up his great silver horn and blew a blast that echoed from the iron cliffs. The challenge was so clear, so loud, so utterly defiant, that it shook the very foundations of the dark fortress. It was a sound that had not been heard in that blighted land for uncounted ages, the pure, unadulterated courage of the elves. Then he hammered upon the iron gates with the hilt of his sword and shouted his challenge for all to hear, even in the deepest pits of Angband. He named Morgoth Bragollach, the Constrainer, the Dark Lord. He called him a craven, a coward, a king of slaves who feared to show his face. He challenged the fallen god to come forth and fight him, champion to champion. Deep within his subterranean throne room, Morgoth heard. He heard the call of the horn and the clear voice of the Elven King naming him coward. And for the first and only time in the long and terrible history of his dominion, the Dark Lord felt a pang of something akin to fear. He was loath to accept the challenge. He knew the valor of the Eldar, and he preferred to command his slaves from the safety of his throne. But his own captains and commanders stood before him. They had heard the challenge that echoed through the stone. He could not refuse. The shame would be too great. His own authority was built on the perception of his absolute power. To hide from a single elf, however mighty, would shatter that illusion. Pride, the very sin that had caused his first fall from grace, now forced his hand. The earth began to tremble. A great, grinding sound echoed from within the mountain, the sound of a being of immense size and weight rising to its feet. The sound of black iron armor scraping against a stone throne. Morgoth was a Vala, a primordial spirit who had helped sing the universe into being. Fingolfin was an elf, a child of that creation. How could such a duel be anything other than an execution? Slowly, the Dark Lord came forth. He was a sight of ultimate terror. No longer did he wear a guise of beauty or majesty as he once had. His spirit, consumed by malice, had warped his physical form into a true reflection of his nature. He stood like a tower of iron, so tall that Fingolfin seemed but a child before him. His black armor was seamless and unadorned, his face a mask of implacable hatred. On his head was a great iron crown, and embedded within it, burning with a cold, malevolent fire, were the 3 Silmarils, the hallowed jewels of the elves. He carried no sword, but a great black mace, a weapon of pure, crushing force, Grond, the hammer of the underworld. As he stepped out, a vast shadow fell across the land, a tangible manifestation of his despair-inducing power. He loomed over the High King of the Noldor, a walking mountain of dread and death. The duel was about to begin. It was the clash of a star and a black hole, of finite courage against infinite malice. Morgoth raised his great hammer. The first blow was not aimed at the king, but at the ground beside him, a demonstration of contemptuous power. Ground descended with the speed of a thunderbolt, and when it struck the earth, it did not merely crack the stone. It blasted a great, smoking pit in the ground, and from that pit, fire and smoke belched forth. But Fingolfin was a light of swords. He was as swift as the strike was mighty. He leaped aside as the hammer fell, the heat of the blast washing over him. Roshalor, his steed, recoiled in terror, but the king held his ground. The hammer was now buried in the crater it had made. For a fleeting moment, the Dark Lord was exposed. With his sword Ringil glowing like a shard of fallen star, Fingolfin darted in, a flash of silver and blue against the black iron of his foe. He was impossibly fast, a blur of elven grace, and he struck a great wound in the Dark Lord's leg. A cry of rage and pain, the first Morgoth had uttered in an age, echoed across the plains, and black, smoking blood gushed from the wound. 7 times Fingolfin would wound the Vala. 7 times the king's sword would taste the flesh of a god. But what weapon is more deadly than a hammer of the underworld? A poisoned word, a whispered truth, twisted into a dagger for the soul. As Morgoth stumbled back, his surprise turned to a deeper, more insidious form of malice. He did not raise Grond again immediately. Instead, he spoke, and his voice was not a shout, but a low, penetrating rumble that seeped into the very marrow of Fingolfin's bones. "Brave little king," the voice hissed, a sound of grinding continence. "You fight for a people you led to their doom. Did Mandos not warn you? Did you not spill the blood of your own kin to get here, only to be abandoned by the so-called guardians of the world?" Fingolfin parried another crushing blow from Grond, but the words were a different kind of assault. They bypassed his shield, his skill, his elven-wrought armor. They struck directly at his spirit. "They watch you now, from their paradise," Morgoth continued, his voice a torrent of despair. "They watch you die for nothing. You are a footnote in a history of failure. Your brother Feanor, the great hero, his fire burned out, his spirit is forever gone. Your sons, Angrod, Agnor, already slain. Where is their light now, Fingolfin? I hold the only light that remains in this world." Was this the true battle, not of sword and shield, but of will against an ocean of corrosion? For every wound Fingolfin dealt Morgoth's body, the Dark Lord dealt a deeper one to his soul. The duel was no longer just a physical contest. It had become a war of narratives, a clash between the elf's hope and the fallen Vala's ultimate, crushing truth. That in a world made by a perfect being, evil itself was an inexplicable and perhaps unbeatable reality. Fingolfin began to tire, the weight of his grief heavier than any shield. His immortal life, once a blessing, now felt like an endless cage for his sorrow. Morgoth saw this. He saw the flicker of doubt, and pressed his true advantage. "You cannot truly die, son of Finwë," the Dark Lord boomed, his voice no longer a whisper but a proclamation of cosmic law. "And you cannot truly leave. That is your curse, not your gift. For I have marred this world, and your spirits are bound to it. Bound to me." A new, more profound horror dawned in Fingolfin's eyes. This wasn't a boast. It was a statement of fact, a revelation of the mechanics of this broken reality. "Where do you think your brother Feanor's spirit went?" Morgoth taunted. "Did it fly free to the timeless halls? Or does it rage, impotent, within the circles of the world I now command? What did you think immortality meant, little king, in a prison I helped build?" With this final, soul-shattering truth, Morgoth raised Garond once more. This time, he struck with the full force of a fallen god. The blow was not aimed to be dodged. It was an inevitability, a crushing finality. Fingolfin, weary in body and shattered in spirit, raised his shield one last time. The impact shattered the shield into 1,000 pieces, and hurled the High King to the ground. His leg was broken, his body bruised and battered, but he was not yet dead. Morgoth loomed over him, placing his great iron foot upon the king's neck. The weight was immense, like a mountain pressing down, slowly, cruelly. But even then, broken and pinned beneath the incarnation of all evil, Fingolfin's spirit blazed one last time. With his last breath, a gasp of defiance, he gathered the final dregs of his strength. He was a king, and a king does not die a victim. With a final, desperate heave, he thrust his sword Ringil upwards, driving the shimmering blade deep into the black foot that held him down. A roar of anguish tore from Morgoth's throat, a sound more terrible than any he had yet uttered. It was not the shout of a victor, but the shriek of a god in agony. The cry shook the very foundations of the Irid Engren, and the armies cowering in Angband heard it and trembled. Never again would Morgoth walk without a limp, a permanent, painful reminder of the Elf King who had dared to challenge him. He would not honor this foe. He would not leave a body to be mourned. He raised his mace Grond to pulp the king's corpse into the dirt, to utterly erase him from the world. But as he lifted his weapon, a shadow fell over the battlefield, a shadow swift and vast, blotting out the sickly light from the Silmarils. It was Thoron Kedor, king of the Eagles, sent by Manwë from the peaks of the Crissaegrim. He stooped like a bolt of living wind, his cry a clarion call of defiance that echoed Morgoth's own shriek of pain. Before the Dark Lord could react, the great eagle was upon him, raking his face with talons like sharpened steel. Blinded by pain and fury, Morgoth was thrown off balance. In that instant, Thoron Kedor seized the body of the fallen king in his mighty claws. With a powerful beat of his great wings, he launched himself back into the sky, bearing the broken but hallowed remains of Fingolfin away from the defilement of his foe. Thorondor flew south, to the hidden valley of Gondolin. There, on a mountaintop overlooking the secret city, Turgon, Fingolfin's son, would build a high cairn for his father. No orc would ever dare approach that sacred place, and no foul creature would ever defile the tomb of the Elf King who wounded the great enemy 7 times, and marked him for all eternity. The light of Fingolfin was extinguished, but his story became a fire in the hearts of elves and men, a song of hope against despair, a legend that would never die. The fall of a king is but one chapter in the war for the jewels, one song in the grand opera of the First Age. To witness the full saga of creation, betrayal, and the unending struggle for the light, subscribe to the _Silmarillion_Chronicles.